You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another Top 10 video. This is one I have been meaning to do for a while now, and I had it in a poll forever ago. And that is Top 10 Underrated Movies. I know you guys have been waiting a while on this one, so apologies for taking so fucking long to do it. Now, I tried my best to order this list based on how underrated I think each movie is, not necessarily on the quality of each movie. Though these are all movies I like, obviously there are different degrees, and if we were going by how much I like them, or even how good of a movie are, both of those would be different orders. And that said, even with me just going on the order of most underrated, the order isn't necessarily definitive, because these are all underrated. This is just the best order I could approximate, so let's go ahead and jump right into the top 10. At number 10, we have the Sharknado franchise. Now, Sharknado has its fans, of course I am one of them, and my friend Spencer, who got me into the series, is absolutely one of them. And something that people often say about Sharknado is that it's intentionally bad, trying really hard to be so bad it's good. But the truth is, I think these people actually miss the point of what Sharknado is supposed to be. They view it as just another dumb, fun shark movie that's just intentionally bad. And while this is true, there is one very key detail that I think the vast majority of people who like to shit on Sharknado miss. Sharknado is satire. The entire franchise is a parody of bad shark movies. It's a movie itself that is making fun of the bad shark movie tropes and overplaying them as a parody. It's because it's a parody that it gets more ridiculous with each movie. I mean, the last one literally has time travel in it. Not to mention the fact that these Sharknados just keep happening is already ridiculous enough, and they go to space in one of them, so it's like, how can you not see that this movie is very clearly making fun of the tropes in crazy bad movies? Sharknado is actually a masterpiece of satire. I think it's actually one of the best satires I've ever seen. Not to mention it is also dumb fun, as you would expect from a movie called Sharknado. It's also a movie you know what you're getting into based on the title. I just think it's kind of crazy how people can't appreciate just how funny of a parody it genuinely is. Alright, that brings us on to number 9, Pandorum. Now, Pandorum is a movie that I'm willing to bet a lot of people haven't heard of. It's a pretty interesting movie about being trapped on a spaceship and going insane with what they call Pandorum, which Ren and Stimpy would call space madness. Pandorum is a very interesting and claustrophobic movie with a very dark tone and a very unique feel to it, and a very interesting twist at the end of the movie, which I won't spoil here. Actually, 2 twists. But it's a really good movie about being stranded alone on a spaceship with only a few people there. There's a lot of interesting characters. There's a cannibal. There's the captain, or whatever rank he is. I don't remember his exact rank. But it's been a while since I've seen the movie, admittedly. But it's a really good one, and I would recommend seeing it if you haven't. Alright, number 8, we have Jurassic Park 3. Now, Jurassic Park 3 certainly isn't the best Jurassic Park movie. I think that undoubtedly goes to Jurassic Park 1. There's no question of that. But I actually would say I think it is the best of the Jurassic Park sequels. That's not to say that I dislike all of the Jurassic Park sequels. I do like The Lost World, though it is fucking boring for a lot of the movie. And I do like Jurassic World, even though it's basically just a soft remake. Albeit, it's not the same movie. There are enough differences to distinguish it as its own thing. It's definitely trying to be a reboot in the same regards as The Force Awakens, although Jurassic World is certainly better than The Force Awakens. But obviously the Jurassic World sequels are terrible. But why do I say Jurassic Park 3 is my favorite of the Jurassic Park sequels? Well, it's quite simple. It brings back that horror aspect that was kind of gone in 2. Like, you had a little bit with, like, the waterfall and the tent scene. And it was cool with the T-Rex in the city at the end of the movie. But I do think a lot of The Lost World does kind of drag on, whereas it never really dragged in Jurassic Park 3. I'll admit one major criticism I do have with Jurassic Park 3 is the kid being alone on the island and then just being able to survive, and being this wunderkind who's like really an expert at survival and was able to get T-Rex pee somehow. Like, the kid is kind of a dumb character that's kind of poorly written. I can kind of overlook that, but it is definitely a glaring issue with the plot. But everything before that is really good, and the birdcage at the end of the movie is really good, and it has a lot of that horror that was in the first Jurassic Park that you don't really see in a lot of the other sequels. Obviously, with the Spinosaurus, there's a lot of inaccuracies about it, having it beat the T-Rex even though it was actually just a fish dinosaur, like it would eat fishes. When realistically, there's not really a dinosaur that could compare to a T-Rex like that. They just thought, oh, it's bigger, so therefore it wins, which is really stupid. But again, it's a movie. And the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park aren't even really dinosaurs. They're made using frog DNA among the dinosaur DNA. So you could argue in the same case like as with the velociraptors, because obviously the velociraptors are super inaccurate in these movies as well, and you don't hear people complain as much about that. But yeah, there absolutely is a lot of inaccuracies with the Spinosaurus, because Spinosaurus really not as big of a threat to a T-Rex as it's definitely portrayed to be in the movie. That said, though, as a movie monster, I think the Spinosaurus was really cool, and I think that Jurassic Park 3 was a really cool movie, and I really like the logo with the Spinosaurus for Jurassic Park 3. Alright, that brings us on to number 7, House of a Thousand Corpses. Now, House of a Thousand Corpses is one of my favorite Rob Zombie movies. To be fair, Rob Zombie's only done so many movies, and there's a few of them I don't like, but I do like most of them. House of a Thousand Corpses, it was the first movie in the Devil's Rejects trilogy, also known as the Firefly family trilogy, including House of a Thousand Corpses, Devil's Rejects, and Three from Hell. House of a Thousand Corpses, I feel, is the one that does get the most overlooked out of those three. Devil's Rejects obviously gets the recognition it deserves, but House of a Thousand Corpses is a very different movie from Devil's Rejects, despite having the same main characters, or main antagonists. Although they're the protagonists of the sequels, they're the antagonists of the original. And I will admit that a lot of House of a Thousand Corpses does seem kind of derivative of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I really like the imagery in the movie. I think it's really cool and gritty. I really like the mermaid scene where they turn Dwight into a mermaid. I really like the beginning scene with Captain Spaulding. There's a lot of stuff I really like with House of a Thousand Corpses. The chase sequence at the end is pretty cool. Overall, I just really enjoy the movie, and the imagery is really cool, and I definitely think if you've seen Devil's Rejects but never seen House of a Thousand Corpses, you should check it out. Again, they're very different movies, but they're both really good. And that'll bring us on to number 6, The Cable Guy. Now, The Cable Guy, for some reason, is the Jim Carrey movie I see get the most hate out of all of his classic movies, when I really just don't get it. The Cable Guy, I think, is actually one of his better movies. It's a really good dark comedy about a creepy stalker becoming obsessive and ruining someone's life and gaslighting all those around him because he won't be his friend. Maybe some people are off-put by just how dark the comedy gets. Maybe people don't like that it kind of goes into the horror genre a little bit. I don't know. But I've never understood the hate for it. I know that some people have complained about, the lisp the character has, but is that really so much as to call it a bad movie? And I'm not, crazy about Matthew Broderick, but he wasn't that bad. Everyone acts like his performance in the movie was terrible, too. I just don't get it. The Cable Guy is such a fun, dark, and interesting movie. I don't understand why it gets so much hate. It has, the creepy loner who also has a sad backstory and never really had any real friends and is just trying to belong, but ultimately becomes a fucking psycho as the movie goes on. Although arguably he's a psycho from the start, but you know what I mean? He gets increasingly more psycho as it goes on. It also does a lot of nice homages to other movies, so I really don't understand why people hate on The Cable Guy so much. I remember The Simpsons did a joke saying it almost ruined Jim Carrey's career, and I know that Channel Awesome put it as one of the top 5 worst Jim Carrey performances, and I just don't get it. I actually think it's one of his best. Alright, moving on to number 5, we have Spider-Man 3. Now, Spider-Man 3 admittedly can be kind of a mess of a movie, and there are a lot of flaws with the narrative and a few things with pacing, and obviously I think there's one too many villains in it. The actual Venom plot feels kind of shoehorned in, but the symbiote stuff with Peter is great. I think Eddie Brock, again, maybe not done the best, but also not really the worst thing either. I definitely think people like to overly shit on Spider-Man 3, but in all honesty, I think it's great. Obviously it's a flawed movie, but it's so much more fun to watch than Spider-Man 2. Everyone acts like Spider-Man 2 is the best thing ever when it comes to the original Sam Raimi movies. But I always found Spider-Man 2 to be pretty dull. I still like it, but Doc Ock isn't a particularly well-written villain. He's just kind of a really, really nice guy who gets the voices in his head talking to him from the chip. They tell him, oh, he's like, I'm not a criminal, and they're like, oh, but you could be, and he's like, well, when you put it that way, let me become the most maniacal and sadistic piece of shit I can for literally no reason. They tried to retcon this in No Way Home to make it so that the chip was actually controlling him the whole time, which I think worked out a little bit better, but they don't really make that abundantly clear in Spider-Man 2. So, I just don't think Spider-Man 2 is the masterpiece of the trilogy. 1 definitely is the best of the trilogy, but 3 I think is the most underrated by far. Throughout Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker's constantly getting shit on, being taken advantage of by people, being trampled over, and nobody really cares about what he wants or thinks. And so when he gets the symbiote in Spider-Man 3 and becomes a douche to everybody, he's absolutely earned it. Like the sequence in Spider-Man 3, which is typically referred to as Bully Maguire, where he's going around and it's playing that song, Drive That Funky Soul. And he's just being kind of a Chad, kind of being an asshole to everybody, but also being very cocky and full of himself. I think he absolutely earned that, given the events of Spider-Man 2. In all honesty, I don't think that Peter did anything wrong in Spider-Man 3. I think that Peter Parker just being kind of a Chad is what makes Spider-Man 3 such a good movie. The symbiote stuff is by far the most interesting thing in Spider-Man 3, and it wasn't even originally supposed to be there. It was a studio change. Don't get me wrong, the Sandman stuff had some interesting aspects to it. There is a retcon involved with it, which I'm not the biggest fan of, involving Uncle Ben. And it is interesting that they tried to make Sandman a sympathetic villain, though I do think it is kind of bullshit Peter just lets him go at the end, because, again, he's still gonna commit crimes. His daughter's still sick. Why would he stop? I also do really like the conflict with Harry and Peter. And though Eddie Brock wasn't done the best, I think he adds some good conflict to the plot, and I think that ultimately it is a net positive. Like I said, it's a flawed movie, but it's honestly the most fun Spider-Man movie. Like, Spider-Man 1 is objectively the best Spider-Man movie. Spider-Man 3 is easily the most fun. Like, when I watch Spider-Man 3, I always have a good time. And speaking of superheroes, let's move on to number 4, Watchmen. Now, if we were going strictly on my favorite, Watchmen would be the top of this list, because out of these movies, Watchmen is easily my favorite on this list. But Watchmen is one of those rare cases where I think that the movie is better than the source material. And I say rare, but actually I have found that to be the case in quite a few scenarios, so maybe it's not as rare as I make it out to be. But Watchmen is so much better than the comic. And I think that's funny because a lot of people will try to say that Watchmen didn't understand the comic and that it ruined the comic and stuff like that, when it's actually fairly accurate to what happens in the comic, and all of the changes, for the most part, are improvements. Literally, the only things I can say are better than the comic is the comedian and Rorschach have more scenes where it develops them more in the comic. But I think even with those omissions, in the movie, they're great characters. The tweaks the movie does to Night Owl makes him such a better character than he is in the comic. The Night Owl comic version I actually don't really like because he's such a weak, pathetic, sad cuck. But in the movie, they toned that down. Like, yeah, he's still pathetic. They made him much more loyal to Rorschach, gave them much more of an on-screen chemistry, and made them much more of actual friends. They made Night Owl much more heroic. In fact, I think Zack Snyder made a lot of the characters more heroic, which might be why some people complain about it, because the point of Watchmen isn't supposed to be that they're heroic. But, as I've said multiple times, you guys know how I feel about what Alan Moore wanted with Watchmen and how I actually feel about it. Alan Moore is a dumb commie who wrote the story to try and have some dumb, over-exaggerated version of the trolley problem, and try to say that all the heroes were actually bad guys and the villain was the good guy, which I think is fucking retarded, especially given the context that the villain kills millions of people to try and save billions, quote-unquote. But Watchmen is a masterpiece, despite of what Alan Moore intended for it to be. Rorschach is a shining example of never compromise on your principles, even in the face of Armageddon. The movie itself is such a good story about not compromising, about the dark side of vigilante justice, the dark side of superheroes. And it's got a really interesting, gritty take on crime. It's got a fun alternate universe where we won the Vietnam War and where Nixon got elected for multiple terms. It's dark and entertaining, and all of the characters have their own philosophies that make them each intriguing and interesting. So I've never really understood why the movie gets hate when all of the major points of the comic are there. The only thing it changes is making the characters better and removing the annoying Black Freighter subplot. In all honesty, the whole pirate Tales from the Black Freighter subplot of the original comic, I always skip when I'm rereading it because it's fucking boring. I know Alan Moore is trying to draw parallels between the Black Freighter and the actual story going on, but I just don't think it works, and I don't think it's necessary. In addition to that, another thing the movie changes for the better is it removes the annoying nostalgia motif that's constantly running through the comic. There's a constant thing in the background and foreground of the comic involving nostalgia by Veidt. And Alan Moore thinks that he's the most subtle and deep when it comes to this nostalgia thing. He thinks it has some sort of really deep, super cool meaning. And so at the end of the comic, there's the scene where Night Owl and Silk Spectre are having sex while Rorschach is dying. And they literally say, oh, it smells like nostalgia, which is fucking lame. In the movie, Night Owl actually beats the shit out of Ozymandias because he killed Rorschach. In the comic, he doesn't even seem to give a shit that Rorschach dies. I honestly don't know how anyone in their right mind could say that the movie is bad, let alone that the comic is somehow better. The comic is good, don't get me wrong, but it is vastly inferior to the movie in all the ways that count. Alright, but that's enough about Watchmen. Obviously, I've talked about it plenty of times on the channel. Now we're moving on to number 3. Boogie. Boogie is another thing that is meant to be sort of a parody. The character of Boogie was originally created to be a parody of, like, action movie heroes. And they go out of their way to make him racist, sexist, hate the poor, loves war, is super violent, is a drunk, is completely self-centered, only cares about money, all sorts of over-the-top, crazy, exaggerated traits. But even though it's supposed to be a parody, the character comes across as super based, and actually a really good character, despite the fact that it's obviously exaggerated and there's a lot of things about it that are ridiculous. It's such a fun movie and it's really funny that it's actually garnered quite a big fan base in the Spanish-speaking world, in the same way that Rorschach has in a lot of ways, where people say that Boogie is actually based and actually a really good character. And obviously I really like Boogie. We did a Mystery Red Eye Theater of it, but that actually got blocked for copyright recently. To be fair, we did show the whole movie. I'll probably do a re-edit of it later on down the line that doesn't show the movie, but that's not my top priority right now. But obviously I like Boogie since I did start a Fallout 3 playthrough role-playing as the character. Boogie's really funny, and it's got a lot of violence in it, and it's also really cool. And I do have one volume of the comic, specifically Volume 4 as well, but it is, of course, in Spanish. But the reason Boogie is so high on this list and being underrated, it's not really well known because, it's based off an obscure Argentinian comic, and then the movie itself was released back in 2009, and I only just heard about it recently because of Corbin. But it's easily one of my favorite animated movies now. Boogie's really cool. I absolutely recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it. It's funny, it's violent, and it's cool. Alright, that brings us on to number 2, A Boy and His Dog. Now, A Boy and His Dog was the inspiration behind the Fallout series. It was a key influence on the post-apocalyptic genre. The movie itself was based off a short story by Harlan Ellison, which I currently am reading but haven't read a whole lot of yet. I actually haven't gotten to the A Boy and His Dog portion of the story because it's actually part of a compilation. I've listened to a few stories in it, but A Boy and His Dog is the last story, so I will be getting to that one later. I want to listen to the whole book in full. The book in question that features the original novella is called The Beast That Shouted Love at the World. But A Boy and His Dog is also a really based movie. It's about a boy and his dog and the evils of a woman who tries to manipulate him. The boy himself obviously is a very flawed character, but he's a teenage boy, so that's to be expected. It's a very graphic and dark world that's loaded with rape and violence and all sorts of brutality because it's post-apocalyptic. But it's also strangely upbeat and has sort of a dark sense of humor about itself. The movie itself is really funny, and the two characters, Blood and Vic, have very good on-screen chemistry. Not to mention the Down Under is a fascinating concept which would later inspire the Vaults in the Fallout series. Obviously there's some key differences between the two, and the Down Under has some really weird quirks to it that are really interesting as well. But it's easily my favorite post-apocalyptic movie, and I do think it gets overlooked by the vast majority of cinema goers. Obviously when people think of, post-apocalyptic fiction, the thing that most people are going to think of first is going to be, Mad Max, or even Fallout, when it comes to fiction. Which, ironically, like I said, was inspired by A Boy and His Dog, which I think Mad Max might have also partially been. It's also got a really unique look that definitely gives me Fallout vibes, there's a lot of greens and stuff in the cinematography, just like there is in the Fallout games. And I think that the loyalty Vic has to Blood is another really good thing in the movie. Overall, it's a fun movie. It's got an interesting sense of humor about itself, and it's delightfully dark, so A Boy and His Dog is easily one of the most underrated movies of all time. Alright, and that brings us on to number 1. Again, not necessarily my favorite on this list, though it is a movie I absolutely adore, and that is Adam Sandler's 8 Crazy Nights. For some reason, this movie is widely considered to be one of Adam Sandler's worst movies. It's considered by many to be a terrible animated movie and to be one of the worst holiday movies. And I've never really quite understood why. Most of the time you'll hear vague things like it being too mean-spirited or that the main character is somehow unredeemable, when I just don't get that. It's actually one of my favorite stories of redemption I've seen. The whole point of 8 Crazy Nights is Adam Sandler's character starts out as an asshole, then you later find out about his tragic past, and he has to come to terms with that and try to make right with the person he's wronged the most, being Whitey Duvall. I think people try to say he's unforgivable because of the sheer amount of asshole things he does throughout the movie, particularly pushing Whitey down in the porta potty. I definitely do think that is easily the worst thing he does in the movie. But really, other than that, most of what he does is just crude insults. Like, everyone acts like he does all these horrible things, but like, he gets drunk at the beginning of the movie, he shit-talks playing basketball, he does shove Whitey's hand down his pants when he's passed out, okay, sure. He pushes him in a porta potty, yeah. But other than that, most of the movie, he's just talking shit and being a dick. Like, you do see him steal a snowmobile at the beginning of the movie and crash into the ice sculpture, so yeah, that's pretty bad too. But again, I don't know why everyone acts like he's such an unforgivable character, when he doesn't really do all that many horrible things. There's a few in the beginning, there's some shit-talking and some being an asshole in general. Really, the only thing I think that people can even comparably actually say is awful is the porta potty thing. People act like this is somehow unforgivable when, to make up for it, he literally gives Whitey the one thing he has always wanted and makes him actually ecstatic about it and actually gives it meaning to him because it's something Whitey has worked his whole life for, and Davy actually convinces the town to give it to him, and somehow this doesn't redeem him in people's eyes? I'll admit some of the humor in the movie can be a bit immature and crass and crude, and sometimes it doesn't always hit the mark. But for me, the humor wasn't even necessarily the main draw, it was the redemption story. And I actually really like the scenes where Davy's being a jerk, because jerk characters tend to really vibe with me. As you guys know, I rewatch 8 Crazy Nights every Christmas, or leading up to Christmas every year, and so it's obviously become a yearly tradition to me. And there was actually like a year that I watched it every night straight, so obviously I really like this movie and am biased in favor of it. And I think that's why I absolutely had to put it at the #1 spot, especially with just the sheer amount of hate this movie gets. I don't get it. The movie has great animation, a good art style. It's very reminiscent of The Iron Giant and actually has some overlap with the staff that animated it. It's got great musical numbers. It's got an interesting story of redemption. And again, sometimes the humor can be hit or miss, but when it hits, it can be pretty fucking funny, too. I think overall, a lot of people are just pussies and don't like it because it's crass and has a mean main character for most of the movie. My biggest criticism, in all honesty, is that it's too short. It's only an hour and 17 minutes. It's such a short fucking movie, but it's such a good movie that that's what leaves me wanting more. When a movie leaves you wanting more, you know that that's a sign of a good movie. And for people to somehow act like this is like the worst thing in Adam Sandler's career, when he's had a pretty big career with a lot of highs and lows, is ridiculous to me. Put this on the same level as something like Jack and Jill makes no fucking sense. 8 Crazy Nights is a great holiday movie, and if you really haven't watched it because you've been told it's bad, I suggest you actually watch it and think for yourself for once. Alright, now #1, 2, because I forgot to put this one on there. There's also going to be a 1-3, spoiler. But #1, 2 is Postal. Postal is easily my favorite comedy movie. I love this movie. I don't know why it gets shit on so much. People try to say it's like not like the game or it's a bad interpretation of the game, when realistically it has all of the major features of Postal 2, and it's a really funny and over-the-top offensive movie, and I absolutely love it. It's also by far Uwe Boll's best movie. Like, his movies, you know, obviously he doesn't have the best track record when it comes to well-received movies. I actually do have kind of a soft spot for Uwe Boll. I think that his movies are charming in their own right, to an extent. There's a lot of flaws with them. There obviously, a lot of them are not good. But I do really like Postal, and Postal, like I said, it's one of my favorite comedy movies, and I don't understand why it gets hate, because it's just a fun, edgy comedy that's based on Postal 2, and is really good. Alright, #1, 3. So with 1, 2, and 1, 3, these could have easily been #1 as well, which is why I decided to put them here rather than just shoehorning them in as 11 and 12. Also because I think it's really funny to fuck with the numbers and make it fucking retarded here at the end. But 1, 3 is I, Robot, which I, Robot is a really cool sci-fi movie. The robots in it are really interesting. The CGI actually is pretty good for the time. It's an interesting Will Smith role. I really like the aesthetic, and I think it's a really good story about robots taking over and stuff like that. I don't know why I, Robot gets hated on. But yeah, there you go. Anyway, this is Fugitive Red Eye. I hope you enjoyed my top 10 underrated movies video. Sorry to keep you guys waiting so long on it. Hope you've enjoyed. Have a good one. Toodles.
That sucked. I'm sure glad that's over with.
I'm gonna fucking die here, Jack!